starts to linger, it's home, I know. If you catch me daydreaming now and forever, thoughts are carrying me along to that place we call home. Down that long road, throughout life we roam. Whenever I go to that place I know, it'll always be home, home to me.
The city of Kingston is located on Lake Ontario at the point where it joins the St. Lawrence River. This community in eastern Ontario has evolved through 4 centuries of history. If you look at the early story and walk the streets of today, one word comes to mind: continuity. From its buildings, its institutions, even its politics, you can trace that continuity with the past. It was one time the capital of Canada. Today, Kingston is known as the Limestone City. She is like a shorebird, carrying her passengers to and from the neighboring island that gave her a name, the ferry, Wolf Islander. Echoing off mansard rooftops, the ship's greeting, as she makes her way to the foot of Princess Street, is a reminder to its citizens that their city is a child of the lake. From infancy, she developed gracefully to take her position in the 1840s as the capital of the Union of Upper and Lower Canada. After the ball was over, an inheritance of architecture remained.
City Hall certainly is the building that is the most remarkable for that period. It's remarkable even now for a place this size, and when it was built, Kingston had only 6,000 people.
Like decorations on a wedding cake, the dome structures are reminiscent of the neoclassical influence popular in the mid-19th century. As in St. George's Cathedral, design reflected trends and purpose. Both were matched to accessibility of materials and craftsmen.
Because there is so much limestone here, and anybody who makes a garden in this part of the country knows there's a lot of limestone. It's sometimes only 4 inches under the topsoil. And because there were, especially the stonemasons who worked on the Rideau Canal, were here to work with the limestone. And when you have excellent material like that so easily available, that's what you use for the better buildings, and the better buildings stay.
Thriving in the shadow of City Hall is something that was around when Alexander Mackenzie was knighted for being the first man to cross North America by land. 20 years later, the conversations here were probably about canal building, or the Pope making their town the see over the newly formed Diocese of Upper Canada. Talk about continuity. This is Market Square. It's been going since 1801. This represents the heart, well, the kitchen of the community. Not only did you stock up your cupboards here, but it gave everybody a chance to find out who's who and what's what. Some things never change. The gathering place. Here the town turned out to celebrate Confederation. And here soldiers assembled to fight Louis Riel. The market is an elder of Kingston's institutions. Produce from surrounding Frontenac and Lennox-Addington counties arrives 3 days a week. For folks like Margaret Angus, stocking up takes place in an atmosphere of ongoingness. Within a block of the downtown hustle, this is what you find. Neighborhoods, steeped in an atmosphere of yesterday. These side streets not only represented, in many cases, the wealth of the elite, but the focus of political power. And as in contemporary times, the issues of the day were voiced in print. A legacy is maintained with Canada's oldest continually published daily, publisher Michael Davies. Do you make a conscious effort in the newspaper to keep the traditions and the history of the city alive?
There's no doubt that we respect the history of this community, and we're one of the people who preserve it, I'm sure, or help to. I'll give you a little example. This building is built, you know, as the newspaper, as the home for this newspaper before the turn of the century. Now, I would say you'd be hard-pressed to go across Canada and find too many daily newspapers that are still in the same building that they were in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. I'm only the 5th publisher since 1834. There's a lot of continuity there, 5 people in over 150 years. My grandfather, who'd come to this country as an immigrant around the turn of the century, had worked himself up in the weekly newspaper business, came to Kingston, bought the British Whig. The next year, he persuaded a friend of his to buy the other paper, knowing full well they would put them together, and they formed the Whig Standard. Now that was, I just gloss over that very quickly, but that was a very, very complicated procedure because one supported the Liberals and the other supported the Conservatives. And for the person who owned the Conservative paper to agree to sell knowing that it was going to be amalgamated, I think it was very traumatic. I'm told by my grandfather that the deal was consummated on the Wolf Islander, that they were right down to the snorting post, and they got on the Wolf Islander and they just kept going back and forth for a few times while they hammered out the final deal.
Woven into the cloth of the Kingston saga is the military. From the time the first European set foot on the soil at the mouth of the Cataraqui River, the beat of the soldier's drum has marked many a dramatic moment. Steve McCready is a military historian.
Kingston area is first settled in 1673. The French came here. Count Frontenac came and settled the area and opened up a fur trading post. It was an ideal spot for trading with the Indians for furs.
The inland seas, the name applied to the Great Lakes by the French, was the connecting highway for their outposts. As a link between Montreal and Fort Detroit, the settlement called Fort Frontenac was a jewel in the crown.
The French were here until 1758. The British arrived and defeated them in a small battle. The fort was taken, and that began the British influence in Kingston, military and civilian influence. Wasn't very much really happened here until the War of 1812 era, and Kingston was very important in that war since it was the major transshipment point for all men and supplies moving between Lower Canada, present-day Quebec, and present-day Ontario, or Upper Canada. And the Royal Navy dockyard was situated here so that all the British ships that were used on Lake Ontario by the Royal Navy had to be built in Kingston. So it was decided that a fort had to be constructed on this site, Point Henry, and that's when the first fort was constructed here, beginning in late 1812, continuing on through 1813.
Number 2 gun! Fire!
Canada had become a pawn in a political chess game. In retaliation for Britain blocking American ships from trading with Napoleon, the United States moved to annex her colony to the north and declared war in 1812. It would be easy. Weren't most of the loyalists of Upper Canada, although British subjects, American-born anyway? That sentiment and the vulnerability of the St. Lawrence front was to have an impact on the future fort at Kingston. The repercussions on the city's later aspirations would be felt long after the Treaty of Ghent brought peace.
In 1826, the military commission came to the area to determine what defenses were required to beef up the area. That's when it was decided to construct the Rideau Canal from Kingston to Ottawa. And it was determined at that point that a much stronger fort should be built on this site. And that's when they decided that the existing fort should be torn down, and the present fort that you see here today, construction then began in 1832, completed in 1837.
In 1838, an event took place in one of these rooms that was to become a landmark in Canadian history. Locally, it was simply a struggle between civil and military power. In reality, it was a festering in the struggle for self-government. The Patriots, led by Louis-Joseph Papineau and William Lyon Mackenzie, brought the growing mood of the day to a head. No longer to be tolerated was the monopoly of wealth and power held by the crown-appointed favorites, the family compact. American sympathizers felt the only solution was to liberate the oppressed. At nearby Windmill Point, led by Niels von Schultz, their attempt failed, and von Schultz was captured. Here, he awaited his fate. And in the midst of all this, something which no doubt influenced his future thinking, was the rising star of Kingston politics, John A. Mcdonald. 3 years earlier, Mcdonald had marked the beginning of his law career in Kingston. He represented von Schultz, who was court-martialed and later hung. But the rebellion no doubt impressed upon Mcdonald the need for autonomous government. He went on to become the presiding genius of the new country for 24 years. Our first prime minister, he would protect the infant nation in true conservative style, especially against the economic ravages of Uncle Sam, if free trade was allowed. I have taken a cottage, or rather, I beg its pardon, a villa, he quipped, when he rented Bellevue House in 1848. Built for a retired grocer, the locals called it Molasses Hall. The atmosphere here provided relief for the young MP's ailing wife, Isabella. While personal problems riddled his life, Kingston always remained a place of the heart.
Kingston was not even an incorporated town when John A. came, and it was a little place. When he came back to his final resting place, Kingston had what we have now. It's penitentiaries, it's university, it's beautiful big churches and everything of that sort.
As soon as the courthouse is finished, we'll build a post office and a customs house, thus getting up 3 fine buildings in Old Kingston. This he commented with pride in 1855 on his most recent patronage accomplishments. Mcdonald's influence was to help shape the city's future. Today, Kingston's inventory of institutions includes federal prisons, the Royal Military College, and its noted university, Queen's. But of all the influences that gave character to this place, carved from the craggy landscape of the Canadian Shield, none would equal her role as a port of call along Canada's fourth seacoast. Return trip number 6 in a day in the life of the Wolfe Islander and her crew. Here, French canoes first beached, and here the British strengthened their navy. The meeting place of the waters of the St. Lawrence, the Cataraqui, and Lake Ontario brought mixed tides of fortune to Kingston's development. It gave rise to her growth in early times, but vulnerability to attack robbed her of her destiny as capital. Originally, restricted passage of larger ships along the St. Lawrence created opportunity. Then widening the seaway rescinded it. Morris Smith, keeper of the nautical past.
During the 19th century, Kingston was a major forwarding port. Ships from all over the Great Lakes came down here to Kingston in relatively larger ships and then transferred their cargo into, why don't we say, relatively smaller vessels for transshipment, forwarding to places like Montreal. So it was a booming harbor during that period.
Along this, the largest body of fresh water in the world, has floated the trade goods of a continent. The cargo arriving on this vessel at Kingston docks was destined for layover in her prisons.
In the 1880s, if you came down one of these streets, first of all, you wouldn't see what you see now. You'd see a forest of masts. You would hear the hooting of steam whistles. You would see steamers going back and forth of all sizes and all shapes. You'd see sailing vessels out in the harbor. You would have the smells of that period, the smell of grain, the smell of wood, the smell of Stockholm tar. You would have all of those things all combining. And of course, the streets that lined the harbor, you would have pubs and taverns and hotels. You'd have all the chandleries that were supporting the ships. You'd have all of that. It was just a completely different kind of place in those days. We still have a few locations in Kingston that go back to that time. Milan's Grocery, for example, are still in business. And yet, 40, 50, 60 years ago, they were chandlers supplying ships that came to this harbor. It must have been a wonderful place to be.
Generations of families in the harbor town knew most of the ships and their captains and mates by name. Traveling the width and breadth of the lakes, they returned home with experiences and stories to share.
Just over there, there's a set of steps, and in June 19th, 1890, the dry dock, of course, was empty of water. Sir John A. Mcdonald went down to the bottom of the dry dock, laid what was called the first stone, got into a little bit of a tiff with the local ecclesiastic about what the right wordage was and so on, but nevertheless, they laid the first stone. The dry dock was built, and this became the substance of the steel shipbuilding industry that lasted from, why don't we say, 1910 up until maybe the late 1950s. By the way, Sir John A., when he finished that task, he then walked along the road there. He went up to Ontario Street. He turned right. He went along Ontario Street that's behind you to the Frontenac Hotel, went in the hotel, and they had a great slam bash-up party where Sir John A. Macdonald obviously drank soda pop and milk and everything else that's associated with his name.
What wooden-hulled vessels were to mariners, the stone garrison was to the soldier.
Squad! Eyes! Right!
A place of challenge and camaraderie. Over the centuries, for thousands of young men like this cadet, the disciplined life in the militia also meant separation from home and loved ones. Kingston would offer a rambunctious private the occasional distraction.
The military presence in Kingston was significant, really has been from the beginning of the French period, even right up till today. There were certainly a large number of taverns and other districts of interest to soldiers, shall we say, that were frequented. Civilians often had a rather negative view of the soldiers, and there are instances of groups of people beating up on a lone soldier as he's sort of weaving his way back from the tavern. That was rare, but it did happen. And there are also many examples of excellent relations between various regiments that came here. Often the regiments had military bands that the commanding officer would loan to the city.
The band plays on. 300 years of military tradition, but one of the layers in a textured history of the limestone city that is. Heritage. Since its ancestral beginnings as a French outpost, through the era of Sir John A. to the present day, you get this idea of standing on the shoulders of earlier generations. If you look at that in a larger sense, the convening of the first Parliament here in Kingston under a new union in June of 1841 led to what we understand today, generations later, as Canada.